All right. I already see there's a lot of people here. I guess this is much anticipated. And also we're a few minutes getting late getting started, but that's okay. So today I'm going to be reviewing another follow-up video. It's only a short 6-minute video from Thinking Christian over the past couple of weeks on my Meta Mondays. I didn't do one this past Monday, just too caught up on other stuff. But we're going to be reviewing a sort of follow-up video on that previous video. So all kinds of stuff on Thinking Christian. Hopefully we could get, and that's Paul over at Thinking Christian. Hopefully we could get Paul back on the channel to discuss this some more. So while I know I've gotten kind of fired up and super critical of the content of the video, I think Thinking Christian is nice guy. No issues with him personally. So as much as I'm going to be very critical, it's out of passion for the topic of getting meta ethics right. Like that's my thing. Which doesn't mean I'll always get it right, but I try. So I also will say that my guest here, Travis, should I call you Travis? I don't know what.
Yeah, Travis.
Cool. Okay. So I noticed that Travis had left some good comments on those videos that I critiqued earlier. And then we got to talking, and then I was like, all right, I like doing this with other people. So I'm not like alone screaming into the wind. So I just invited Travis kind of impromptu, like, hey, why don't you join me? And we'll both go over this, so you'll get a couple different perspectives. So that's what we're going to do. Travis, do you want to introduce yourself? I put a link to your channel in the description. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I'm Travis. I have a YouTube channel. So far, I haven't posted that much on it. I only have about 6 videos. Most of the videos I think so far are about meta ethics, but that's not the only thing I talk about. I do talk about some like other things like normative ethics and applied ethics as well on there.
Cool. All right. And so I don't actually know that much about I don't know if there's much more you want to say about your background or what you do. If you don't and you want to get into the video, that's cool too. I don't know. Like, do you study philosophy? What's your deal?
I mean, I don't have any like formal kind of education in philosophy. It's just kind of something I'm interested in. So I kind of just like watch videos about it, like read about it, kind of like as an informal hobby.
Cool. So I'm a big advocate of people doing this. It's something that I say because, ever since, because I started the channel a while back, like what, over a year ago now, I can't keep track anymore. I got my PhD in the middle of that. And then people start calling me Dr. Bush, which is very often they're doing it, I guess, ironically or enthusiastically. But I do worry when you have those credentials that people take you more seriously than they should. And then like people that study things as a hobby are often like people go, oh, well, they don't have a degree. That stuff annoys. And we'll see in the video that there's a reference to, because I've already watched this video. I watched it like 5 times and I was writing comments on it. There's this reference to credentials. Now, I'm not saying credentials don't matter. I still got that bug on my camera. I'm going to get that fixed at some point. It's been like a year. So we could get into that a bit, but basically I am all about breaking down like the whole ivory tower stuff. And, one thing about philosophy in particular is it often has these days this kind of whiff of elitism and academic pomp and pompousness. And I really don't like that. And I'm not saying all philosophers are like that. A lot of times philosophers will dress like super casual and they'll be, less likely to be super fancy about stuff. And I like that, but I want to bring back that vibe of, philosophers like, out in the world interacting with the real world, because I actually think it makes their philosophy better. Anyway, I don't want to get too much on a soapbox about that. So, all right, I'm just going to say hi to everybody real quick, and then we will get the video up. We'll check the sound, and then we'll get going. So let's see. I did, over on Digital Gnosis, Nathan gives people Nathan nickels when they show up early, and I was thinking of doing some kind of currency. So I got to figure that out. Someone recommended Lance Bucks. Don't know if I like that too much. We'll figure that out later. But hi, everybody. Sapir, I don't know if you're directing that at me about asking if I'm doing okay. But I was on Danny's stream last night on TikTok. So that was my first time. Well, I've been on TikTok before, but I was more of like an official guest host with Danny, and that was a lot of fun. So go check me out on TikTok. I might be on there later today. I'm trying to get more followers in there. I never forget if I never remember if they're called followers or subscribers, whatever. I'm talking a bunch of nonsense. Go check out my TikTok. It's also Lance Independent. And I'm still going through to see if anybody else is saying hi. They're not. Cool. Okay, so let's get into it. So I have too much energy today, so I'm trying to say 14 things at once. Okay. we are going to share screen. Here it is. One moment.
Hey everyone, this is
I think I'm sharing the wrong video. Give me 1 second.
Oh, isn't that the right one?
I think it
Nicole-
is, but then one of my our
Yeah.
one moment. I figured out what happened. It started playing this video, which I also had open in another tab when I started sharing that one for whatever reason. Okay. So that was the right one. It's just acting funny. Alrighty. Sorry about that. Okay. Now just let me know how the sound is and I could turn it up or down.
Paul.
Okay.
In this video, I'm going to explore the question of whether moral relativists can
It's
criticize
fine.
moral views.
Sounds fine to me. How about the audience? Does that sound too loud? I know that sometimes the volume, it's like, if I record this now and then the volume sucks later, I can't fix it easily anyway. So anyone in the audience, let us know. Okay, 1 is good enough for me. So let's get into it. I said I was going to do 3, but 1 is good enough. To me, it's slightly low, so I'm going to turn up just a little bit. Okay.
Hey everyone, this is Paul, and in this video, I'm going to explore the question of whether moral relativists can criticize the moral views or the moral code of other cultures. Now, there were some comments in my video on atheism and moral nihilism claiming relativists could criticize other cultures as moral codes. A few even went so far as to claim I misunderstood or misrepresented certain aspects of relativism, though considering the fact that I'm citing actual philosophers who published in this area, I'd say it's actually these critics who are misunderstanding the literature. And this is especially the case in light of James Rachel's paper on the challenge of cultural relativism, which I cited and explicitly quoted from. So by extension, these critics would, I guess, also be accusing him, an actual moral philosophy professor, of misunderstanding and misrepresenting moral philosophy. Now, to get started.
Okay, so any thoughts on those initial remarks?
Yeah, so the first thing I noticed when I was watching this video for the first time is that, first of all, like the appeal to, well, this same critique has been made by a professional philosopher. I mean, it's not really kind of out of the ordinary, I think, to see professional philosophers misunderstand or misrepresent anti-realist positions. And when I say misrepresent, I don't necessarily mean intentionally, but just kind of get things wrong. Like, I've definitely seen that before. And also the first thing I noticed was he says, so like the implication is that if we're saying that he's misunderstanding the view, oh, you must be saying this professional philosopher is also that they're misunderstanding philosophy. And the kind of implicit implication of that seems to be like, oh, that's an absurd charge. But I mean, surely Paul himself thinks that professional philosophers can get things wrong about philosophy, because his original video was called Why Atheism Implies Moral Nihilism. And there are plenty of philosophers that are both atheists and moral realists. So tons of professional philosophers don't think atheism entails moral anti-realism. And presumably, Paul is going to say those professional philosophers are wrong about that.
Yeah, if you look at the 2020 Phil paper survey, I'm sure people on the channel have heard this a million times already, but it's something like 80% of philosophers that were surveyed are atheists, and then 62% are moral realists. If you control for the philosophers that responded to the survey that are theists, you still get a majority of philosophers are both atheists and moral realists. So it's not just a lot, it's a literal majority of them. And that puts some tension on the claim, like, hey, this particular philosopher made these claims, and the implication, as you know, is that there's something sort of absurd about questioning a philosopher. But we can actually point to the whole sort of superstructure and like sort of thesis of the original pair of videos that prompted this reply video from Thinking Christian is a claim that the majority of philosophers would presumably reject. In fact, not only is it the case that a majority of philosophers are both atheists and moral realists, that's only telling us which ones actually endorse both views. It's not even telling us the total proportion that would deny that atheism entails nihilism, which may very well be most of the remainder of those philosophers as well. I don't even think, personally, I suspect if you presented this proposal to academic philosophers, then a majority of them would not only reject it, but not even take it seriously. They'd say that's absurd. Like, this is just not a serious matter of contention. Now, they all could be wrong. But the point would just be, if there's something absurd about people criticizing thinking Christian for appealing to what a philosopher said, that's a little bit weird, given that the overarching thesis is a claim that entails or implies that the vast majority of professional philosophers are wrong, not just one of them. So that's like, it's not even like there's a symmetry here. This is asymmetrically in favor of like our perspective on this, at least with respect to the evidential weight there. The other thing is just that, thinking Christian, like anybody else that's sort of presenting the views of someone else, it's not like, hey, I'm quoting this person and I'm presenting what they say. So if you disagree with me, you disagree with them. It's possible that thinking Christian has misunderstood them or not fully contextualized what they've said. Now, one of the things about cultural relativism in particular is that there's this substantial element of cultural relativism where, understood as a distinct meta-ethical position, it's a very narrow view, but it also has a history of association with the humanities more broadly, and especially anthropology. And there, it's understood as a much more comprehensive view, that it has normative implications, descriptive implications, empirical implications of view. Hey, there's lots of cultures around the world. You can't judge them by our standards. You have to judge them by their own standards, and you should be tolerant of them. So it's like a big package. And I don't know exactly what Rachel said specifically, but if someone is operating within that framework, they may not be operating within the 2024 contemporary analytic meta-ethical relativism framework, which is much more narrow. And so it wouldn't even be that we disagree with Rachel's. It's just that we're taking cultural relativism, like I'm taking it in a narrower sense than I think you are, than Rachel's may be. I would have to go check, but that would be my, I suspect that that's probably the case, or at least that's plausibly the case. In other words, basically, if someone is saying, hey, if you disagree with me, you disagree with this person whose views I'm presenting, there is a possibility that they're not accurately representing that person's views. So there's that too. Just as a general point.
I did skim through that Rachel's paper. Yeah.
And what did you find?
Oh yeah, I did skim through the Rachel's paper, and I didn't read it in full, but I skimmed through some of it, and I did see some very bizarre claims in it. Like, one of the claims was, if we say that X is better than Y, that implies some objective standard to evaluate the two things. And that seems completely false. Like, if I say, strawberries are better than blueberries, I don't take it that implies, there's some stance independent way of evaluating the tastes of the two different fruit. Something can be better relative to a subjective standard.
Right. Yeah. And so that's a point worth stressing here, which is that not only is there the sort of tensions that we pointed out, but philosophers are often just wrong about that, or don't accurately represent relativism and anti-realist views more generally. Did you have anything else to say about that particular part, about the whole sort of appeal to philosophers, or do you want to keep going?
Oh no, I was just going to agree with you that it's not just atheist moral realists who would disagree with the claim that atheism entails moral anti-realism. There's tons of anti-realist philosophers that would disagree with that. And I'm sure there's even theist philosophers who would disagree that atheism entails moral anti-realism. So, I mean, it's a lot of philosophers that he's saying are wrong. So I don't think the appeal to one single philosopher here on this point of cultural relativism is very persuasive.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going.
Consider a culture like Saudi Arabia, or a country like Saudi Arabia, where homosexuality is punishable by death. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to make any normative judgments about homosexuality or Saudi Arabia. I'm just using this as a current example because I think it's a good example, because for those of us in the West, this is a very shocking idea. Now, relativists in the US are free to criticize Saudi Arabia of failing to conform to their own standards. And of course, relativists in Saudi Arabia are also free to criticize those in the US for legally protecting homosexuality. A citizen.
I feel like, can't we stop there? Like, cultural relativists can critique people. But one point to make about that is that there's two different senses of, because I don't really think we could stop there, because the original claim that I'm disputing is whether or not cultural relativists can criticize other cultures. I mean, among other things I'm disputing. We should disambiguate two senses of that. One is like, literally, are you able to do the action? Like, can they criticize them? Yes. But I don't think Thinking Question or anybody else that typically says cultural relativists can't criticize other cultures literally means like they're actually incapable of doing it. Rather, I think what they mean by can is like can in a way that's justified or can in a way that would be consistent with their views. It's more of like a sort of normative injunction against doing so. It'd be a bit like if someone's saying, hey, you can't drive over the speed limit. It's not like you physically can't get your car to move faster than the speed limit. It's that can't means like not allowed in that normative sense. So just to be fair to the view and clear about the view, when he says they can do this, I don't think this is any like major concession. You may disagree with that or have something to say about that, but I do just want to highlight those different uses of can.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't. So the way I interpreted it, and so maybe this interpretation is wrong. I don't know what exactly Paul meant, but I did interpret it almost like as a concession because I didn't take it that he was saying in this video, something like it's just like logically possible for like someone to criticize like other cultures, or something like that. I mean, I think if you play it a bit more, he says, oh, you can criticize other cultures like for not conforming to the standards of your own culture. So I kind of took that as kind of saying him recognizing that a cultural relativist could say that another culture's practices are wrong relative to the standards of the culture that the critic is in.
Yeah, and if that's the case, that might be a bit of a concession. For me, I think that I'm a little concerned, and you may be right about that. I guess it's just, for me, it's just not clear. But I do think that those cans and the like able to and are permitted to senses do need to be disambiguated, that typically people mean it in the permitted to. But we may get to the agent and appraiser relativism distinction, because I do think the failure to clearly draw that distinction has tripped up a lot of philosophers, and by extension, a lot of people that have interpreted those philosophers. Let's play a bit more as you suggested, and we'll see if there's more to say here. And again, if you have a point where you want to comment and I'm still playing the video, just like let me know, like wave your hand at me or something.
Citizen of each of these countries or cultures can criticize the other for failing to conform for their standards, and this point is just trivially true. In fact, under any form of relativism, one can criticize others for failing to conform to their own views. I mean, I can criticize people who like pineapple on their pizza for liking something I don't, even if, I'm a gastronomical relativist. But this misses the whole point of Rachel's and, among others, criticism of cultural relativism. The question isn't whether or not people engage in this sort of criticism, uttering the words, quote, this culture is wrong because it fails to conform to my standards, but instead, what these criticisms are based on and whether they have warrant. In other words, whether these criticisms are based on fact or fallacy. The problem of moral...
So, I mean, I take the question of whether the criticisms have warrant. That seems like a completely different question to me than whether they can make the criticisms. Because it's definitely consistent with meta-ethical cultural relativism to criticize other cultures. Whether like the criticism is warranted, that just seems like a separate question. And I would also say that it seems to me like whether a criticism is warranted or not is itself going to be relative if it's some sort of criticism made on normative grounds.
Yeah, that very well might be the case, that whether or not it is warranted, like warranted according to what standard. The relativists may not agree on the same standards of what does or doesn't warrant a particular type of action. There's also another tricky issue here, which is that there's sort of two different ways, I should say at least two different ways in which someone could be permitted to do something. So take like whether you're permitted to file a complaint, like you think somebody wronged you and you want to file a complaint. You may be allowed to file a complaint, even if it turns out your complaint, like once the details are revealed, is spurious or not fully justified, and it's rejected. And in that sense, you're warranted in filing the complaint in the sense that, or permitted to file the complaint in the sense that you're allowed to do so. It's consistent with whatever system of rules you're operating under. But then it would turn out that within that framework of rules that allowed the complaint to be filed, the complaint is ultimately rejected. And in that respect, you might not be warranted or justified in the complaint. And so you'd have to disambiguate the difference between whether a person that's like a culture relativist that's criticizing another culture, like it's consistent with the norms and principles they adhere to vis-a-vis being a cultural relativist to criticize another culture, and then a sort of a, like you could say like a more object level type of warrant or justification, which is what if the criticism is like a bad criticism even within that framework. So for instance, here would be an example. Let's say we just grant cultural relativists are allowed and they may and they can criticize other cultures, and then you criticize another culture for a practice that they don't even engage in. You're like, this culture engages in human sacrifice. And then it turns out they don't. Well, now your objection is not warranted, but it's not warranted relative to your own standards, which is presumably your own standards. Like you actually have to have accurate beliefs about what the culture does. So what type of warrant is he talking about? Is he talking about an overarching normative framework, or is he talking about internal to the system? So it's part of the concern here is, and this is so common in these issues, like you have to be precise and disambiguate things. And there's often different senses and meanings of terms. Like, I just don't know what's meant by warrant here.
Oh, also, he says, well, all of the criticisms based on fact or fallacy. But I mean, if someone's criticizing another culture's practices for not being in conformment with, say, like the practices of like a Western like culture or something like that, I mean, it is going to be a fact that, the culture that the critic lives in disapproves of the practices that this other culture is engaging in. Now, maybe he
Yeah.
means like a stance independent moral fact. But then it's like, sure, if that's what you mean, then it's not being made on like those grounds. But then a relativist is just going to reject that criticism has to be made on those grounds.
Yeah, I think that that's right. The other thing is just like, if I'm criticizing from a relativist framework and my criticism is an expression, I'm saying something like this. Hey, I have these sets of standards. That culture over there has a different set of standards that I don't like, and I object to them because they're inconsistent with my standards. I want people to conform to my standards. So in my culture, we don't do this bad thing. In that other culture, they do. I don't want them to. I don't like it. When you say it's like based on fact or fallacy, I don't know exactly what the fallacy would be there. So in that case, assuming you've accurately described your culture standards, that culture standards, and accurately and honestly reported your disapproval of that culture standards, you're not getting any of the descriptive facts wrong. So like in terms of descriptive facts, you've accurately described everything. I've got these practices. They have these different practices. I don't like them. If that's the substance of your criticism, it almost seems like a category mistake to say that you're like committing a fallacy or making a mistake. I mean, it's really going to depend on what's meant by fact or fallacy there, but you're at the very least not like incorrectly describing anything, if that's all the criticism amounts to. That someone in the chat did ask this: can we get a firm definition on what your guest means by criticism? If you mean Travis, I don't know. Do you want to take that question?
I don't know that I have like a precise like definition of criticism. I guess I was just thinking of, in this context, any case in which you morally condemn the practices of other cultures or say that they're wrong. I think that if you're a relativist, you're going to think that those sorts of statements are going to be relative to a given set of moral standards. You can't say that you can't morally condemn a practice of a given culture on like stance independent grounds if you're an anti-realist and a relativist.
Right. Okay, cool. All right, let's keep going.
criticism under cultural relativism is that it becomes arbitrary. The point being, if you were born in the US, you would be criticizing Saudi Arabia's policies on homosexuality. Whereas if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you would be criticizing the US's policy on homosexuality. And if you didn't actually under relativism, you would be failing to adhere to cultural relativism itself. Put another way, it's basically an accident of birth that you hold the current moral beliefs and criticisms that you do. And you could say this in some way forms a genetic debunking argument. Now, someone could object that this commits the genetic fallacy. I mean, after all, couldn't someone be born into the culture that has the right set of moral views? This is wrong because cultural relativism denies there's any metacultural right set of moral beliefs by definition.
Yeah, I'm a little puzzled at like when he brings up stuff like someone could say this and then appeals to like a realist standard and then is like, that's wrong. Who would say that? Like only someone that doesn't understand the position. So it's a little weird when someone brings up possible objections and then shoots them down, but the objections are so bad that like no person that has any idea what they're talking about would raise the objection. I think it can give an audience the impression, look at this, I'm diffusing the sorts of defenses that a cultural relativist could give to my objections, when really you're sort of creating these sort of artificial, weird, confused positions. Like, hey, imagine a person was totally confused about everything. They would be wrong. Look at that, as if that's in some way critiquing cultural relativism. You know, I hate to say this because I hate invoking fallacies, but it's almost literally like an invocation of like a straw man. It's like creating an artificial argument nobody endorses, shooting it down, and then presenting that to an audience as though what exactly? Now, there is a charitable way to read this, which is the audience may be confused into thinking here's a solution. I'm going to tell you why that's not a good solution, but I do still think whether Thinking Christian intended it or not, this can give the impression that this is sort of diffusing the possible defenses of a sort of reflective and consistent cultural relativist when it's not doing so.
Oh, by the way, I meant to say this earlier, but earlier in the video when he says that, like he acknowledges, like, yes, a cultural relativist can criticize other cultures for not conforming to their own, to like whatever the standards of the critics' culture are. And then he says, of course, that's trivially true, but this misses the point of like Rachel and others' criticisms. I mean, like the criticism made in the original video that people were objecting to, like Paul just says, if you're a cultural relativist, you cannot condemn the practices of other cultures. You cannot say that the practices of other cultures are morally inferior to the practices of your own culture. Like he never invokes stance independence in the original video. He doesn't say, oh, a cultural relativist can't say that the customs of their culture are stance independently better than that of other cultures. He just says a cultural relativist can't say that the customs of their culture are better than that of other cultures. And it's like, if that was the criticism, it's like not something I would have even objected to, because I don't disagree that, you know, if you take a view that rightness and wrongness are relativized to stances, then you can't criticize other cultures on stance independent grounds.
Yeah, it seems that at that point it becomes like a pretty trivial observation. Like, hey, if you don't think they're stance independent moral facts, then you can't say anything is stance independently wrong. Yeah, like no shit. Of course you can't. It's almost like telling an atheist, hey, if you don't believe in God, then you can't go around telling people that God disapproves of their actions. Well, yeah, you can't. What's your point though? Like, yeah, it's so similar to that, and I think it reveals a presumption that's somehow important or desirable, but that's exactly the kind of thing that a relativist could just deny. They could say, yeah, I'm not criticizing them on those grounds. I'm criticizing them by appealing to my own standards. What of it? What's the problem with that?
So this doesn't work, and this objection would betray a misunderstanding of relativism itself. And there are other problems here, other challenges as well. Suppose you're, a petroleum engineer who moves to Saudi Arabia because of your job. Do you need to be acclimated to a new moral culture? Should your moral beliefs update to favor punishing homosexuality by death because you are entering a new culture? Well, this depends on what forms the basis of your culture, whether it is where you live, where you're born, maybe some combination of each. Perhaps it adapts over time. So as you become acclimated, perhaps you should, under relativism, become more and more supportive of executing homosexuals, because this is more and more part of your own culture if you were to move to a country like this. But regardless, the fundamental
One thing to say about this is it can create some challenges for some types of cultural relativism to specify like what cultural standard you're subject to. But this doesn't strike me as some sort of like massive insurmountable problem. Saying, hey, this is challenging for this view to account for doesn't show that the view is wrong. Like you could say the same thing to a utilitarian. Hey, if you actually think that normative moral theory ultimately bottoms out in maximizing utility, hey, it's going to be really hard. Is this action actually going to maximize utility? It's so hard to find out. Yeah, it is. It's not necessarily a fatal issue. That's one point. The other would just be that, yeah, if a person goes from one culture to another, we could still ask the question, for any given action, is it right or wrong relative to the culture they came from? And is it right or wrong relative to the culture that they're currently in? That doesn't change. The only time this would become an issue is if you endorse a type of agent cultural relativism where the agent is bound in some way to such that their normative actions are like they ought to conform their actions to whatever culture they're like is like the primary one that's regulating the rightness or wrongness of their actions. And then there might be this like really challenging epistemic question of which culture is that? But appraiser relativism completely circumvents this issue. So
Yeah, I was going to
I don't understand the
comment
focus on agent relativism.
on I was going to comment on that. I think sometimes people almost treat relativism as if it's like this normative position that like you should do whatever your culture approves of, or if it's individual relativism, well, you should do whatever you personally approve of. And it's like, well, it's not a normative position. Like relativism doesn't make normative demands on people. Like it's perfectly consistent to be like a meta-ethical relativist and think that it's sometimes wrong for people to do what, their culture or they themselves desire.
So I do think we need to be careful here because I think that that's more or less true of some type of appraiser relativism. So if you're an appraiser relativist, then you think that that claims about whether an action is right or wrong are made true by the standards of the culture of the person evaluating the action. So if there's some culture that has some bad practice, like I don't even have to say bad, there's some culture that has a practice. If I'm evaluating that culture and I say that's bad, whether that statement is true or false for an appraiser relativist appeals to my culture's values, not the values of the culture performing the action. It's only agent appraiser relativism where it's the standards of the agent within the culture. And so what we see here is that there's a sort of presumption of agent relativism only, not appraiser relativism. And that failure to disambiguate causes all sorts of problems. Now, appraiser relativism, if it's understood very minimally to be something like an evaluation in the meaning of moral claims, then like it's just going to tell you the truth value of moral claims, and it's going to index those claims to the standards of different cultures. That doesn't seem to carry significant practical normative implications. Some types of agent relativism, there's more robust kinds of agent relativism, and this applies both to cultural relativism here and subjectivism, do have normative implications. But this is something that I've pointed out before. One, those are not the only types of cultural relativism and subjectivism, these ones that bring in the normative stuff. And two, to the extent that they do so, they're actually bringing in the types of concepts and features that realists invoke for realist accounts, often specifically non-naturalist accounts. So you could think something like this as a cultural agent relativist. You could think that whether an action is right or wrong is determined by the standards of the culture of the agent performing the action, and that the standards of the culture of the agent performing the action actually generate reasons. They actually generate imperatives that are then authoritative and binding on the agent. For example, if you're in a culture where it's okay to steal, then, or let's say it's obligatory to steal in a particular case, this actually makes it the case that the agent in that culture is obligated to steal because their culture has that norm. And that's a type of agent culture relativism that does have normative implications, but that's a conception of relativism. It's not like all forms of relativism carry that implication. So I agree with you in the sense that like my understanding of like the really pared down, maybe this isn't exactly your view, but there's like these pared down meta-ethical relativist views that basically say, look, when people say stuff like that's wrong, they mean that's inconsistent with the standards of my culture. And that sort of semantic analysis of the meaning of those claims just doesn't have, there's no authoritative force. There's no categorical imperatives. There's no practical oomph. There's nothing compelling a person in virtue of the fact that they're a member of a culture to act in accordance with the standards of that culture. If you do think that, that is technically a type of anti-realism and culture relativism. But weirdly, the features of it that make it objectionable are the very features of moral realism that I find objectionable. So it's like, okay, sure, then cultural relativism is most objectionable when it has elements of realism. Not a particularly good criticism of anti-realism.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to express with that statement is that relativism, like itself, as a broad kind of like category of views, does not like make normative demands of you. I wasn't necessarily trying to deny that there are like some forms of relativism that make normative demands. Kind of like if I were to say that anti-realism doesn't commit you to thinking that all moral propositions are false or all moral statements are false. There could be certain forms of anti-realism that commit you to that, but like the kind of anti-realism itself is like a broad category of different views would not commit you to that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So thanks for clarifying. Yeah. So relativism as a general category, just like the way I would construe it is it's a view according to which the truth status of claims within a given domain are made true in a way that's indexed to some possibly variable set of standards. Maybe that's not the best definition, but basically what it means is like claims within a given domain, whether it be morality or epistemology or whatever, like X is the case or X exists. Whether that claim is true, you would have to say, okay, according to which standard? You'd have to relativize the truth status of the claim to one of multiple possible frameworks, such that the truth status is indexed. Kind of like, the example I always give is something like, if I say I am Lance, when I say I am Lance is true, if you said I am Lance, it's false. And so the truth status of statements that use the term I are indexed to the speaker, because I is referring to whoever's making the statement. And so I take relativistic accounts to take the sort of domain they're operating over to have truth status vary in that way. That, if you were just stopping there, that has no direct normative implications at all. It just doesn't. If you would have to have a more robust relativism that says, not only is that the case, but then also, if this is true, then this normative implication follows from it. And in virtue of this normative implication following it, you are like bound by some authoritative norm that is compulsory for you to comply with. That's like extra stuff. That's not just a part of relativism as a general category. Are we on the same page on that?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, I think that's a great point. I think I might have initially misunderstood what you were saying a little bit. So thanks for clarifying.
Fundamental issue here is, what reason is there to think that accidental properties like where and when you're born is necessarily a good reason to hold certain beliefs? And moral beliefs are no exception here. And note the relative.
Just real quick on that, you don't have to think like the accidental properties of where you happen to be born are good reasons for thinking what you think. So there's all sorts of accidental factors for why I have the food preferences that I have. But it would be really weird for someone to say, hey, it's just this, like all these accidental matters of like history and like who your parents were and where you grew up. That's why you prefer this flavor of food over that flavor of food, or this music over that music. Like you need good reasons. Those aren't good reasons. You don't need reasons for your preferences. They are what they are. You don't need to justify them. Maybe I'm going to take it back because maybe I lost track of what he was saying there. So I think that follows here.
To become acclimated, perhaps you should, under relativism, job. Do you need to be acclimated to a new moral culture? Should your moral beliefs update to favor punishing homosexuality by death because you are entering a new culture? Well, this depends on what forms the basis of your culture, whether it is where you live, where you're born, maybe some combination of each. Perhaps it adapts over time. So as you become acclimated, perhaps you should, under relativism, become more and more supportive of executing homosexuals, because this is more and more part of your own culture if you were to move to a country like this. But regardless, the fundamental issue here is, what reason is there to think that accidental properties like where and when you're born is necessarily a good reason to hold certain beliefs? And moral beliefs are no exception here. And note, the relativists cannot even claim their own set of beliefs as capital T true or object.
Yeah, they, again with this, like, they can't claim it's capital T true. It's really strange. Yeah, a moral relativist can't claim that their moral standards or stance independently true. I don't understand what his point is. Of course they think that. That's an entailment of their view. Why is that an objection? It's like the objection is, hey, your view, according to which there's no stance independent moral facts, you can't invoke stance independent moral facts. What's the objection? That's just a restatement of an entailment of the view. To make the atheism comparison. Imagine if someone said, if you're an atheist, you can't even say God exists. Well, how is that an objection? Again, the tone and the style of presentation is presenting this as though it's an objection. What's the objection?
Yeah.
It's weird. I'll keep going unless you want to add something. I guess raise your hand again if you do.
Objectively true because they hold to relativism. So by believing in relativism, they must abandon honest criticism of other cultures.
There we go.
Yeah, so if you're a relativist, why would you have to abandon honest criticism of other cultures? Like, if you criticize another culture as a meta-ethical cultural relativist, what exactly is dishonest about that? And it's like, we can like compare it to like kind of other forms of normative, or like other forms of of relativism as well. Like, if you're an aesthetic relativist, for example, and you think, maybe you think whether a movie is good or bad is relative to like some set of standards. Like, would that mean it's dishonest for you to write a critical movie review? That would just be a very bizarre thing to say that that's dishonest or it's not honest.
Including non-relativistic cultures, because under relativism, they would believe in a different moral code. They were born just accidentally in a different culture. So this is what moral philosophers mean when they say relativists cannot criticize other cultures. We don't have any reason to believe our cultural criticism holds any weight or means anything under relativism. This is because we have no way of arbitrating between our own moral criticism and the moral criticism.
Yeah, I don't holds any weight. What exactly did he say? I want to get that exact wording.
Reason to believe our cultural criticism holds any weight or means anything under relativism.
Holds any weight or means anything. So if, to use like an analogy, like a movie thing, if I don't like another movie, and I'm not a cinematic realist. So if I don't like a movie and I criticize it, I write like a bad review, it'd be weird to say it doesn't hold any weight or mean anything, because there's no independent standard from which to evaluate the goodness or badness of movies apart from our subjective attitudes and preferences. It certainly does mean something to me. Like, I could say, here's why I don't like this movie. So this idea that it doesn't mean anything, I think that's, ironically, I'm not sure that means anything. Like, what does he mean by it doesn't mean anything? Does he mean it? I think a lot of this sort of implicitly circles back to it's not stance independent. And I think a lot of this is just a bunch of different ways of saying, hey, if you deny stance independent means of evaluating things as good or bad or right or wrong, you can't evaluate them as stance independently good or bad or right or wrong. Like, you're just repeating what you can't do as if that's an objection. That's my take on this. Do you have a take on that?
I agree with what you said.
This is because we have no way of arbitrating between our own moral criticism and the moral criticism of others outside of our own person was born. And the relativists themselves doesn't think that there's any place one could be born that has a better or more true moral code, because this commits the kind of metacultural criticism that relativism forbids a priori. So it's clear a relativist can utter the words, Saudi Arabia is wrong in their treatment of homosexuals because it doesn't align with my culture. but they have no objective reason to think this is superior to someone saying America is wrong in their treatment of homosexuals because it doesn't align with Saudi Arabia's. And they have every reason to think that if they were born in Saudi Arabia, they would agree with Saudi Arabia's stance on homosexuality. In fact, many would make a normative judgment and say, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you should agree with your local culture's views and cultural criticisms as well. As a result, cultural relativism ends up destroying itself. Other cultures are absolute and not relativist at all. So if you were born into a non-relative moral culture, then by moral relativism, you should abandon moral
I don't know what
relativism
he means
altogether.
by some cultures are non-relativistic.
He's going to get to it. What he's going to do is make a sort of second order relativistic claim, which is something like this. If some other culture, if they're a bunch of realists, then this causes some kind of problem for the relativist. But the problem is that meta-ethical relativism is a view about the truth status of first-order moral claims. It's not a view about the relativistic nature of second-order or meta-ethical claims. In other words, it's not meta-ethical relativism, which would be the claim that claims about what's true or false within meta-ethics is only true relative to the standards of the meta-ethicist that's making the claim. That's not what meta-ethical relativism is. He's actually going to mention that and then criticize it. So I think that's what he's getting at. Let me take it back a little so we could hear that again.
As well. As a result, cultural relativism ends up destroying itself. Other cultures are absolute and not relativist at all. So if you were born into a non-relative moral culture, then by moral relativism, you should abandon moral relativism altogether.
Yeah, so the idea here is if your culture is, if the members of your culture are moral realists, then a consequence of being a moral relativist is that you would have to be a moral realist. That's what I think the claim is. So if in this culture, everybody is a moral relativist, then relative to that culture, you should be a moral relativist. But if in another culture, everybody's a moral realist, then relative to that culture, you should be a moral realist. And that's ridiculous. That's what I think the objection is supposed to be.
Yeah, okay then. I mean, it's kind of strange because, you know, on like meta-ethical relativism, it's going to be like specifically moral judgments that are relativized. It's not like it's going to be like any judgment that's going to be like relativized. Presumably, like you can be like a relativist and say like, well, it is a stance independent fact that there are no stance independent moral facts, and you know it's not like that's going to be relativized.
Right. Yeah. And that's because relativism is about first order moral claims. So normative moral claims. This is right. That is wrong. This is permissible. It's not a view about the relativism of second order claims like there are no moral facts or there are moral facts or whatever. He's going to mention this. And I think he thinks that like it's a move a relativist could make to say, no, it's just about first order. But like it always was. But we'll see.
Moral relativists are thus claiming that it is objectively true that moral beliefs are only subjectively true, which is actually very difficult for me to understand. But
I don't see what's difficult to understand that. Like, would he have would he find it similarly difficult to understand a similar claim about like other normative domains? Like if someone were to say it's objectively true that statements about like taste, whether a food tastes good or bad, can only be subjectively true. That they're like, that seems like it's perfectly easy to understand if someone were to say, well, it's a stance independent fact that there are no stance independent facts about what tastes good. So I'd be curious if like Paul has like a similar issue understanding a claim like that. And if he can understand a claim like that, like what kind of makes saying the same thing about the moral domain any different from like another normative domain, like taste or something like that?
Right, because it'd be one thing to say that you think that it's true about taste, that it's a stance independent fact that there are no stance independent first order gastronomic truth claims or whatever. Sorry, that there's no gastronomic truths, not truth claims. But you could say it's true. That's true. But then when it comes to morality, it's false. But he's claiming to not even understand the position. and that's a
Yeah.
stronger claim. I would be curious to hear what he has to say about that. Like if he can understand it in the domain of food and taste, and if he can, why can't he even understand it in the case of morality? Because they look symmetrical to me in terms of the sort of metanormative properties we're talking about.
Let's see an example. For instance, Saudi Arabia does not believe morality is relative at all. So relative to Saudi Arabia,
I didn't notice this initially, but does he say Saudi Arabia believes that?
He said Saudi Arabia does not
true,
believe
which is actually
that
very difficult
morality
for
is
me to
relative
understand.
at all.
But let's see an example.
Yeah.
For instance, Saudi Arabia does not believe morality is relative at all.
Okay, just to be a little pedantic, Saudi. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, like, it seems like, first of all, that's an empirical claim, and second of all, it seems like if you're a relativist, you're just going to reject that.
Yeah. So there's one, it's an empirical claim. Two, like he just says Saudi Arabia doesn't believe that. Presumably, of course, he doesn't actually literally mean like Saudi Arabia. Like the people in Saudi Arabia, generally speaking, are realists. How do we know whether that's true? Like, I don't think there's been any, like, again, this is my area of research. I've never heard of a study on the meta-ethical views of people in Saudi Arabia. I don't think that there is one. If anybody knows about one, please let me know. But we have, as far as I know, zero empirical evidence that people in Saudi Arabia are moral realists. Now, someone might go, oh, we don't need empirical evidence for that. It's obvious that they are. But the empirical evidence that we do have doesn't lend a lot of confidence to claims that everybody in this particular population or that particular population are moral realists. We get super variable proportions of people endorsing or giving realist and anti-realist responses. There has been a little bit of cross-cultural research. There's the Sarkisian et al. Paper where they look at, I think, in China, China, Ecuador, and Poland. China, Ecuador, Poland, and the United States, they get pretty high anti-realist rates. Thomas Pohl's, some colleagues just published research, I think in Japan, where they had pretty high anti-realist rates. So when people have actually went out and done studies, they're not getting, and this isn't to say all these studies are like valid and definitively answer the question, but like, we just don't have good evidence. So yeah, there's that. And then as, yeah, I mean, your point is a relativist can just say, look, they can't really be wrong about what's morally right or wrong relative to their standards, but they can be wrong about meta ethics. Like even if they did hold that view.
So relative to Saudi Arabia, their citizens under relativism should deny relativism itself. And to me, this is just absurd, and it shows that relativism is self-referentially incoherent. Now, one way a relativist could try to get around this would be to claim that meta-ethical judgments, like relativism itself, could be objectively true, while normative judgments like killing homosexuals would be relative. But I don't.
That's exactly what they would say, because that is what the position is. Notice he frames it like they could try to get around it, as if they had this problem. He points it out, and then they're like, "Oh shit, I got a problem. Let me try to solve it." But that was never a problem in the first place. Did you have anything that?
I was gonna say, like, I do think there is like one way to kind of steelman the claim, which is like, hypothetically, if there was a culture that most like it was a realist culture, and they just thought like realism was true. Relativism wouldn't necessarily say that they're right about that or that they should believe that. But we could, I suppose, hypothetically imagine a culture that has the moral standard that you should believe in moral realism. Like, I suppose that is something that's theoretically possible. Like, you could have a culture that just has like a strange kind of normative view where they think like it's a moral obligation to believe in moral realism. So I suppose that could be like a steelman of the kind of claim he's making here.
I think that that's right. I don't think that makes, even if that were the case, I don't think that would show that relativism is self-refuting. Do you?
Oh, I agree with that. Because, people make a similar claim about, utilitarianism. Like, they say, oh, maybe on utilitarianism, you should actually not believe utilitarianism if that maximizes utility. And it's like, well, maybe that's the case, but like I don't see how that would make it. I don't see how that's grounds for self-defeat, how that would make it self-refuting. And so similarly in this case, I don't see how that, self-refutes relativism.
Yeah, I agree. So those are the like self-effacing objections that like if the view is true, one entailment of the view is that people shouldn't believe the view is true. Now that can be true, but even if that were true, it would make the view false. It would just mean you shouldn't believe it. It's consistent that a view is both true and that you shouldn't believe it. So that all this, I think, at best would show is that if cultural relativism were true, it's consistent with that some cultures shouldn't believe that it's true. But that doesn't show that it's false. It only shows they shouldn't believe it. And once you draw that distinction, this just does not show that the view is false. It just shows that the view might have some like funny and weird implications. Like it is a weird implication that it like possible implication that if utilitarianism were true, it might be that nobody should believe that it's true. That's weird, but weird isn't wrong. We're almost to the end of this.
I don't think this works because as soon as metaethical beliefs have normativity attached, it becomes immoral to believe in relativism under relativism if you live somewhere like Saudi Arabia. Thus, under relativism.
So he does exactly what you proposed, which is to sort of you can moralize anything and make it, you could sort of subsume it within your normative framework. And he's saying, yeah, as soon as you do that, that becomes a problem. But it doesn't for the reasons that we just said.
If relativism is true, belief in the truth of relativism itself would be immoral if you were born into a place like Saudi Arabia that denies relativism, which I just think is pretty ridiculous. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I think if there's one thing we should learn from Saudi Arabia, it is that we shouldn't believe in moral relativism. Anyway.
Okay, so that got us through the video. Any commentary, thoughts? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of bizarre because I take it that nowhere in that video did he actually really defend the claim that I think you and I and others were objecting to, which is that if you're a metaethical cultural relativist, you can't object to the practices of other cultures. It seems like, that was the criticism he made in the original video. In this video, it seems like he doesn't really defend that point. He kind of just pivots to, oh, well, if you're a metaethical cultural relativist, you can't condemn the practices of other cultures on the grounds that their stance independently wrong.
Yeah, that seems like if the position sort of retreats to that, it seems like quite a bit of a weaker position. So I guess we could leave the critique of the video at that. We'll see if Paul responds or wants to talk. I'm happy to talk to Paul. Don't know if you are, but hopefully we could just get more of a discussion about all this stuff going. But one thing I wanted to ask, because I'm not a cultural relativist or a moral relativist like at all. I have views that are somewhat similar to subjectivism in some respects. And yet I'm defending cultural relativism against what I take to be not the strongest objections to it. I'm kind of motivated to sort of defend all the anti-realist positions out there, like even like non-cognitivism. I'm not a non-cognitivist. When I feel like they're being unfairly or sort of incorrectly criticized. What about your own views? Are you a cultural relativist or any type of relativist, or do you endorse some other metaethical view?
So, yeah, I mean, I am a moral anti-realist. When it comes to the kind of different flavors of anti-realist views, I don't really endorse any of the like semantic theses of the other like anti-realist views. So I don't endorse like the semantic thesis of any form of relativism, but I do like when I personally use moral language, I do use it in a like individual relativist way. Like when I make moral statements, I'm saying this is right or wrong, relative to my moral standards. If I say something is wrong, for me, like that would translate into something like X is out of accordance with my moral standards.
But so if someone just asked you point blank, like, are you a moral subjectivist? Would you say yes to that?
I mean, if someone asked me that, I would say, like, I wouldn't give like a yes or no answer because like I don't really think that would like encapsulate like fully explain my view. I would say like I personally use my own moral language in an individual subjectivist manner, but I don't endorse like the semantic thesis of subjectivism. I don't necessarily think everyone else or most people are using moral language in an individual subjectivist manner.
Yeah, so I do the same thing, and I do think it's a little unfortunate that the sort of mainstream categories and positions for anti-realism are framed in terms of like a conjunction of claims, like both like how the speaker might speak and their metaphysical views, and a claim about how everybody speaks, as if you have to endorse both or neither. And I do the same thing. I don't have to take a position on how other people speak to tell you how I speak. But it's just a legacy of philosophy that they are just kind of like, well, of course, the way you speak is how everybody speaks. There's one way to correctly use sentences. And it's almost like to try to give a more nuanced response is to already deviate from the standard framings in a way that I think some philosophers at least wouldn't like. I mean, like humor literally just says you got three options. You've got subjectivism, non-cognitivism, error theory, and those are your only possibilities. He just straight up says that. And I just find that really bizarre. It's like, I don't endorse any of those.
Yeah.
Something's got to change because I haven't seen too many people publishing as anti-realists that don't pick one of the three. They always pick one of the three. And like, until we start getting actual academic publications that are saying, hey, you don't have to, I don't think a whole lot's going to change. Have you seen Don Loeb's paper on moral incoherentism?
No, I haven't.
Okay. I would recommend checking that out because Don Loeb is the one that popularized that whole gastronomic realism. He wrote that paper.
Yeah, I have read that paper, the gastronomic realism one.
If you like that, his other thing is incoherentism, and it's a fun paper. It's not as fun as the gastronomic realism paper.
Okay.
All right, so that about does it for me. If you want to direct people to your content, anything that you like write, produce, read, anywhere they could find you, where can they do that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm kind of like this. I just have like I don't have like a Substack or anything like that. I have like the YouTube channel. Then I also have a Twitter. And both of them are like the same name. It's Travis Talks too. And two is like spelt out. It's not just the number. I actually did think about changing the name on my channel, the kind of display name, because I think it might be kind of hard to search up, which I didn't really like think about at first. Because like the V in my name, it's not a regular V. It's kind of like the V in like the little circle. So I feel like that kind of makes it like hard to search up my name. So I might just change it to a regular V.
Might be a good idea. Yeah, I put a little bit of thought into how to market myself, and I ended up going with like, I'm going to use the same logo everywhere I go, and I'm going to use the same name everywhere I go, and no special characters or anything like that to make it more searchable. So someone else proposed the name that I ended up using. I do think one downside of my name on here is it's a little bit long. And it also has like a disadvantage, like it has part of my actual name in it and then part of not my actual name. So I don't get the advantage of using my actual name, and I don't get the advantage of not using my actual name. So maybe it has some downsides, but I just thought the pun of stance independent, lance independent was too good not to take advantage of. But yeah, maybe some rebranding. That maybe it'll make things easier. I'll throw a description or a link to the Twitter.
And I do have to say, it took me a while to get the Lance Independent thing, because at first I thought like it was just kind of like a newspaper reference, which I think is maybe like part of it, but I didn't like realize the like stance independent play on words until later.
Yeah, it started as a blog, and that was part of it too. So it checked a lot of boxes. So I was just like, yes, this is like the greatest name. I had considered a few other names. At this point, I can't even remember what they were. So I don't know. Give it some thought. And then, okay, so if you're in the audience, check out Travis's stuff, YouTube channel, Twitter, all that stuff. I don't have a whole lot else to talk about today for now, but I will probably be heading over to TikTok shortly. I have something to do right after this, but then I'll be over on TikTok. So I wish I could just say, go ahead, head over to TikTok now, but head over to check me out on TikTok pretty soon. Also, Lance Independent, so I'm going to be easy to find there. And I should be on there for a little bit. And then I also have another discussion today at 6. So lots of streaming today. Thanks so much, Travis, for being a guest. I hope you had a good time. I'd be happy to do this again and review other videos with you.
Sure.
And yeah. Okay. So I'll say goodbye to everybody. And anything else, last things you want to say?
I don't know. I can't think of anything else to say, so I guess we'll just leave it there.
Cool. Okay. Sorry, I keep putting you on the spot. I want to give everybody the opportunity to talk, and I know that I'm very talkative. I just get too much energy. Okay. Cool. Thanks so much for being here, everybody. Also, the same stuff I always say: like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave comments in the comment section, and just stay tuned because we got more stuff on the way. Take care, everybody.